Hello, my name is Roger Claxton and welcome to this series of bite-sized talks entitled Poor on the Moor. The talks are in segments and based on the records in the Widecombe archive and a project that commenced in 2011 to digitise and catalogue them. The talks are based on the contents of the recently published book Welfare in Widecombe 1700 to 1900, written by me. You can get a copy through our website widecombe-in-the-moor.com/welfare and various other outlets as shown here. There are also e-book versions available. This is the third segment of the Poor on the Moor series of talks and discusses the process of raising the money for welfare purposes. The main way that money was raised was through the rates system, pretty much as we know it today. Property had a rateable value and the rate was levied against that value in multiples of a penny in the pound. Occupiers usually paid the rate, with landowners being charged, e.g. where the property was not occupied. Rates could be levied for various purposes. The main ones for us were the poor rate and the church rate. The highways rate was also important. The amount to be raised was not necessarily known in advance. The rates could be collected as often as necessary and need not be once or even twice a year. Also, the total amount was not limited, so there could be several collections in the year, each for different amounts, e.g. a five-fold rate, 5 pennies for each pound of rateable value, and later a treble rate, 3 pennies for each pound of rateable value. There were arrears, and these were followed up. Sometimes, but not always, they were recorded in the account books. The churchwardens and overseers' account books that we see today contain the final fair copies of the accounts. No doubt the working copies were less clear. The churchwardens and overseers were generally taken from the ratepayers and served for a limited period of 1 year. They will have varied in their abilities and time available, no doubt, but hopefully once you had completed your term it would not come around again for a long time. There are some other points to bear in mind, and these are listed here. Firstly, accounts were generally from one Lady Day to the next. Lady Day was the start of the new year only up to 1762, but Widecombe continued with this convenient tradition. Generally, the church rate was much smaller than the poor rate, for good reason, but also helped by rental income from the church house and houses at Dunstan, which went towards the church expenses. Although these were parish properties, there was of course at that time a fuzzy distinction between what was church and what was parish. Other sums were raised through private donations, etc., and these are covered in much more detail in the segment on other provisions. Now let's look at a specific example of an entry in the overseer's accounts, in this case from 1805. These accounts are fully transcribed and reproduced in the welfare support pages at widecombearchive.org.uk/welfare. But here we'll just look at a small extract from the first page of the accounts. Hopefully you can read this, but if you can't, I'll take you through it. Widecombe Parish, a treble poor rate of 3 pence in the pound, then made by the churchwardens and overseers of the poor of our said parish and other principal inhabitants of ye said parish, for ye relief of ye poor, the several persons are rated as follows, and then it proceeds to list all of the people who were paying the rate and the amount that they were paying based on their rateable value of their property. So I'll just take you through one or two of these. So the first one is the Reverend Mr. Rendell, who's the vicar, and he's paying poor rate on his tithe receipts. And then the Right Honourable Lord Ashburton, who's paying poor rate on the rectorial tithes, which he's probably obtained by buying out the previous owner of those tithe receipts. And then for hire Natsworthy or occupier, in other words, the Right Honourable Lord Ashburton owns hire Natsworthy, and if he doesn't pay the rate, then the occupier does. And also similarly for lower Natsworthy or occupier. And then George Norris for a tenement in lower Natsworthy, and William Smurden or occupier, ditto, also lower Natsworthy. The accounts then go on to list all of the owners and or occupiers that paid rates from all of the quarters of the Widecombe parish. We'll then move on to the summary at the end of the list of receipts, and here we can see part of that summary. The first half I'll skip over because this is what's known as the widow's gift, and I'll be covering that in a later segment. And then we get on to the summary receipts, and here you can see that the treble rate that was discussed at the beginning of the accounts were actually collected 4.5 times, totaling 4.5 times the 3, which is 13.5. So the sum of 13.5 rates totaled £317, 17 shillings, 11.25 pence, a farthing. Now you can see here that obviously there's been some sort of error, and so they don't always get a fair copy at the end, but never mind. And then various other receipts that are listed here. First of all, received of the last overseers, in other words money left over from last year. Received of John Lamble towards the maintenance of Anne Hamlin's base child, BC, so in other words maintenance payments. Received from James Hamlin for Anne Lehman's base child, and so on. And there are a few other sundry receipts further down, and as we've said previously, you can view the whole of these transcripts at widecombearchive.org.uk/welfare. If we move from the overseers' accounts to the church warden's accounts, you can see that the church rate was collected in a very similar way and from almost exactly the same people. And you can see the detail of the 1805 accounts here. So let's go quickly through the writing here. Widecombe Parish, April the 7th, 1805. It looks like 1806, but actually it's 1805. A rate or assessment made upon the inhabitants of the parish aforesaid, or their respective occupiers, or tents, which is tenements, or lands, within the said parish, at 3 halfpence in the pound, towards the paying of necessary expenses or disbursements that have and shall be laid out and expended before the next visitation court in and about the parish church and ornaments thereof, also the church house, church yard and tower, and all other things thereto belonging by us, whose names are hereunto subscribed, to be collected as often as need shall require. So if they needed to collect more money, they could. There was no restriction on the amount they could collect, although, as we've noted, it's much smaller in quantity than the poor rate, for example. So a quick look at some of the amounts here. First thing to note is that the tithe payments are not payable on the church rate. You remember the poor rate was levied on some tithe payments, which doesn't apply to the church rate. So the occupier of Higher Natsworthy pays 1 6. George Norrish for Lower Natsworthy pays 1 2. The occupier of another tenement in Lower Natsworthy pays 1 6. And William Smurden, or occupier for a tenant in Lower Natsworthy, pays 1 2. And so it goes on again as before through all of the 4 quarters of the parish of Widecombe. So that's the end of the third segment, which I hope has given you some idea of the process of raising money for the poor and for the church from the landowners and or occupiers. Please stay with us for the next segment, which discusses how the money was spent, as we have said, primarily for the poor. Thanks for listening.
They'll lift me up and lay me down, gently down, till I reach consecrated ground. Along the old bridge way, on 6 strong shoulders I will sway. Lay me down, gently.